APASA Café, our almost monthly colloquium featuring cutting-edge Anabaptist scholarship. Thank you for joining us. My name is Martin Lutz. I teach social and economic history at Humboldt University in Berlin, and I should probably add it's the original Berlin, the one in Germany, not the one in Ohio or elsewhere in North America. We are six hours ahead of time, at least compared to East Coast time. To begin, I'd like to acknowledge Andrea Waxmonsky, an integral member of our scholarship committee here and the one who manages the technology to make this event possible. Thank you very much once again, Andrea, for all the work that you put into this behind the scenes. It's very much appreciated. And for those of you who are joining us for the first time, I ask you to save your questions for the end of the presentation, or you can also put them in the chat. Our presenter is going to be presenting for about half an hour, and that should allow us for plenty of time for questions and discussion afterwards. And for those of you who do join in our discussion after the presentation, your questions and comments will be recorded, and those recordings will be available to our members on our newly designed website, so it will not be publicly accessible. And without further ado, I will introduce today's speaker, Rose Fisher. Rose is a PhD candidate at Penn State University at the Department of Germanic and Slavic Languages and Literatures. She holds a BA in psychology and German from Millersville University, and currently she's a dual title PhD candidate in German linguistics and language science. She is also a native Pennsylvania Dutch speaker and has spent a considerable amount of time in Germany, so is very fluent in contemporary German language as well. Currently, she's a Fulbright scholar affiliated with Marburg University in Central Germany, and I should probably add that Marburg is possibly even world famous for its language program, so it's probably the best place to do research on German language and German dialects. Rose thus combines all the qualifications needed to study Pennsylvania Dutch as a living language, the title of her talk today. Rose, I'm very happy to welcome you to a cafe session today, and I look forward to your presentation. Thank you very much for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. I think that spares me from having to say too many things about myself. Thank you to that kind introduction. So I will just dive right in. I did actually want to talk a little bit more about my background, just because I think it, makes sense given the topic that I'm talking about and working with. So I was born into an Amish family in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. These are some pictures of my family from that time, the time before we left. I'm the one circled, just so that you can pick me out. And you might be wondering, how did we get these pictures? My sister, as you can see, one of my sisters is a quadriplegic, so wheelchair bound due to a virus that she got when she was a baby. And so because of this, she had outside help coming in, or my family had outside help coming in to help take care of her. And one of those nurses took these pictures, and we're very happy for them now. But that's how come we have them. So yeah, my parents left the Amish in 2007 when I was 11 years old. And you can see Lancaster County here in red on the map. Okay, so I'm gonna move on then. As you can see, I've remained very interested in my heritage, in particular in the language. So I'm gonna talk about how Pennsylvania Dutch formed, how it developed over time, who its speakers are, who speaks it, and then also some of the linguistic features of the language. So first of all, what is it? It's a German variety, most similar to Palatine German, and the Palatinate or Rhineland Palatinate is a state in Germany that's shown here on the map of Germany in red. So it's not exactly like Palatinate. It really isn't exactly like any other kind of German that's spoken in Europe, but a lot of its features are shared with Palatinate. So that's the one that it's most similar to. It formed in the United States throughout the 1700s when German-speaking immigrants came into the United States from different parts of Germany and Switzerland, but primarily from the Palatinate. It has today in the US group and region-based dialects, and I'm going to talk more about what those look like and how to distinguish them in the rest of my presentation. And I also want to note that it has shaped and been shaped by the local English varieties wherever it's spoken. I think this is an important point because we're dealing with a bilingual situation, and it's important to recognize that the influences go both ways. It's not just Pennsylvania Dutch being influenced by English, it's also English being influenced by Pennsylvania Dutch. So one example of English influence on Pennsylvania Dutch would be saying wie bist, because in standard German or in other varieties of German, you would say wie geht es dir, which is a different construction. It's made up of different words. So wie bist is German words that are put together in an English way. And there are lots and lots of examples of that. But then there's also Pennsylvania Dutch influence on English. For example, in my dialect of English, we can say, what for dog is that? Meaning like, what kind of dog is that or whose dog is that? So that's an example of taking a Germanism into English. And then I also have this, this book here as an example. It is a bit exaggerated and possibly not very scientifically sound, but it's basically also showing how the English that's spoken in these places where there's a lot of Pennsylvania Dutch speakers, you get these Pennsylvania Dutchisms, like ain't it something how it keeps on making down. So again, a bit exaggerated, but it helps make the point. Okay, so some of you, maybe even all of you, are already familiar with what Pennsylvania Dutch sounds like, but in case you're not, I have written here a little description of this picture or of what I associate with this picture. And then I'm also going to play it for you so that you can hear what that sounds like. So it's a recording of me saying this little paragraph here.
Ich bin Rose. Ich war Amish geboren. Das ist ein Picture von meinen Brüdern, zwei von meiner Schwester und mich. Ich habe noch zwei andere Schwestern. Wenn ich ein kleines Mädchen war, hatten wir ein paar Hunde gehabt und wir haben uns oft kleine Puppies gehabt. So war auch really fun. Ich habe viele gute Memories von so Zeit in meinem Leben.
Could you hear that, first of all? Okay, good. Great. Yeah, so in case you don't speak any German or Pennsylvania Dutch, I hope you can at least see, you know, there's English words mixed in here, puppies, fun, memories. Totally normal in modern varieties of Pennsylvania Dutch, but it's still pretty German in its structure. Okay, so I want to talk next about who speaks the language. One of the really important distinctions here is non-sectarians versus sectarians. So you might wonder, or maybe you know, but you might also wonder, what is the difference? Both groups come out of the Protestant Reformation. The non-sectarians are primarily German Reformed and Lutheran. Originally, they were mostly farmers and lived in rural, isolated communities, mostly in Pennsylvania. And they spoke Pennsylvania Dutch for about 200 years, which is really a pretty long time if you compare with other immigrant groups. And they also had many monolinguals, especially earlier, which 200 years ago was not very uncommon in immigrant communities in the US to have people who only spoke the immigrant language and didn't speak English at all. That was a lot more common, about 200 years ago. Now they are well integrated into modern American society, and even though they still celebrate and value their language and their culture today, the language really is only spoken by a very small minority, and it has very few native speakers. So it's pretty much, it doesn't look like the language will continue to be spoken, at least not as a vernacular, as a language of daily communication in this community. At least that's not how it functions today. With the sectarians, on the other hand, they are Anabaptists who were persecuted in Europe, primarily Amish and Mennonites, but also some other groups like the Brethren. And they came to the US mainly for religious freedom. And they also, as we probably all know, really value keeping some separation between themselves and the rest of society. Historically, they were the minority of the groups that the founder groups that spoke Pennsylvania Dutch. They were actually only about 5%. And to this day, some of them, not all of them, maintain visible separation from the rest of society. So you can see it in the way they dress or in other practices. Whereas you have some sectarians who maybe don't dress differently and you can't tell immediately by looking at them, even if they still hold sectarian values like pacifism, for example. Okay, so I want to talk also a little bit more about the linguistic differences between the sectarians and the non-sectarians. So first, looking at the non-sectarians, they are unbalanced bilinguals. And what I mean by this is that they were originally made up of individuals dominant in Pennsylvania Dutch. At least that was the majority of people. So they spoke Pennsylvania Dutch better than they spoke English. But within 1 or 2 generations, early in the 1900s, they flipped and became dominant in English. So in their history, sorry, excuse the background noise. Some car going by outside my window. Where was I? Yeah, so there was never a point in their history where they were pretty much evenly using German or Pennsylvania Dutch and English, kind of balancing between the two. So that's what I mean by unbalanced. Their Pennsylvania Dutch is, to the extent that they still use it, and was originally more conservative. So what I mean by that is they kept more of the German and didn't let as many English influences seep in. So one example of this is that they still mark dative case. So dative is the mia in by mia, like with me, versus by mich, which is what you would see with the modern sectarian varieties. They are also considered post-vernacular speakers, and this is as opposed to vernacular speakers, which is what the sectarians are. So a vernacular is a language that you use for daily communication. You use it to talk to people, to get your point across. Post-vernacular speakers are people who speak the language in order to celebrate it, and they speak it as part of their heritage. They don't necessarily speak it for everyday communication purposes. Sectarians, on the other hand, at least for the groups that still speak Pennsylvania Dutch, are pretty much balanced bilinguals. So they maneuver between Pennsylvania Dutch and English pretty easily. So they still speak the language daily in their communities, and they're usually very highly proficient in English as well. Their Pennsylvania Dutch is less conservative. So what that means is that they tend to let in more influences from English. So they've lost dative case, they would say by mich. They use a higher proportion of English loanwords, and their English has less interference from Pennsylvania Dutch. So this means when they speak English, you don't hear Pennsylvania Dutch sounds kind of creeping in as much. Still, of course, it still does, because every bilingual is influenced by both languages that they speak. So you can still hear a Pennsylvania Dutch accent when you hear them talk English, but it's not as strong as the non-sectarians dominant in Pennsylvania Dutch as their accents were. It's just another indication of how good they are at speaking both languages. And lastly, they are diglossic vernacular speakers. They speak the language as part of daily life. And diglossic is just a way of saying that you tend to use one of your languages in certain contexts, like Pennsylvania Dutch in the home, and another one of your languages in other contexts, like English at work. So let's talk a little bit more about the differences between the different kinds of sectarians. There are multiple, some might even say many kinds of Mennonites. I don't know exactly how many there are, but yeah, some of them are well integrated into society. The more progressive Mennonites you wouldn't necessarily recognize if you saw them as something different than any other person on the street. But then there are other old orders which are not better integrated than the Amish, and some of them are even less integrated, even more separatist than some kinds of Amish. So that's kind of a misnomer that the Mennonites are more progressive than the Amish, because not all of them are. By some measures, there are over 40 kinds of Amish. Maybe we could argue about how many exactly there are, but let's just agree that there are a lot of different kinds. They're not all the same. And the Amish and the most conservative Mennonites have these things in common. They use horse and buggy transportation. They limit technology use, which doesn't mean they don't use technology. It just means that they're careful about which technology they accept. And they use traditional one-room schoolhouses, which provide education through the 8th grade and don't allow education beyond that. And so, yeah, so those are the things that they have in common, but then there's also a lot of differences that are regional and group-based. So for example, the color and design of buggies. So I have here buggies that are classic for the Amish of Lancaster County, where I'm from, but you also get yellow toppers, black toppers, white toppers, brown toppers, everything you can imagine, different shapes and sizes. Clothing is another way that they can vary. So we can see here from the Lancaster Amish, they have the heart-shaped coverings, and then Midwestern have the round ones. So lots of different ways of being, of expressing an Amish or Mennonite lifestyle. And then the last point I have here could be a whole multitude of things, religious and cultural practices, but the one that I have pictured here is that the Amish of Lancaster can use these scooters. They're not allowed to use bikes, whereas the Mennonites of Lancaster, Old Order Mennonites of Lancaster, are allowed to use bikes. So lots of diversity. Okay, so I also just want to talk a little bit about the population of Pennsylvania Dutch speakers. So there are 367,000 something Amish in the US as of 2022, over 6,000 in Canada, and a little over 200 in South America. And then Pennsylvania Dutch speaking Mennonites, they're about 28,000 in the US and almost 8,000 in Canada. So that brings us to well over 400,000 Pennsylvania Dutch speakers in total. And that population is also increasing at a pretty rapid rate because these groups tend to have big families and tend also to retain their members. Okay, so I want to talk now about linguistic differences between the regional linguistic differences between some sectarian groups. So the most important divide is the Eastern Midwestern one. So Eastern is spoken in Pennsylvania and its daughter settlements, which may also be in the West, which makes it confusing. But yeah, so the ones that originate in Pennsylvania. And Midwestern is spoken in Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Iowa, and their daughter settlements. And this is due to an early migration split in the main Old Order communities. So very early in the history of the Amish in the US, some groups split and went and moved west. And so those are kind of the two basic groups that we have here. These communities are well aware of their differences, linguistic and otherwise. In my experience, this is generally true with these kinds of groups. It's very easy to tell who belongs and who doesn't, not just by how they speak, but by how they look and any number of other things, how they dress. And the R sounds are one good example of this linguistically. So the Eastern speakers use the American English retroflex R instead of the original tapped R, which you would still find in some varieties of German. So in my dialect, we would say brof, for example, just like you would say brave in English with the BR. And then the Midwestern speakers also show some influence from English, but less so. So they do use the retroflex R instead of the original tapped R in some English loanwords, and also in words where there's just one R at the beginning of the syllable, like in roet. But otherwise, they keep the tapped R. So they would say brof. I might not be able to pronounce that perfectly, but like a more kind of rolled, or rolled at least one time, kind of like in the Spanish R. So these differences are noticeable to the speakers. And one example of that is a Midwestern perception of Eastern speakers who said their Dutch is hard to understand. It's so R-y. And I remember this also being a topic when I was a kid talking to people from other places. And that quote is taken from Stephen Hartman Kaiser's work. Okay, so one other difference that I want to talk about relating to R between Eastern and Midwestern is the alternation between a vocalic R and a consonantal R. So we're going to look first at Midwestern Pennsylvania Dutch. I hope you don't get scared by this very linguistic-y looking table. But what we're seeing here is ich war, or I was, where you get the R becoming a vowel. And the same thing happening here with ich verliere, or I lose. So the R there becomes a vowel because it's at the end of a syllable. When it's the plural form, mir ware, or we were, then you get a tapped R plus the E sound there at the end. So you have the traditional tapped R there. Nothing unusual, but then what's interesting is what happens in Eastern Pennsylvania Dutch. So you still get ich war, where you get the R turning into a vowel at the end of a syllable. And this happens in all German varieties pretty much. So this is nothing strange. But then what's interesting is that in the plural form, you get mir war, not mir wara or mir wada, mir war. So the E gets lost there and you get a very strong English R. So this is, I think, one of the reasons that people say it sounds so Ari. So der and der, or der and dera, works the same way. So it's not just in verbs, it's kind of all over the language. But what I think is cool is that in both dialects, the difference between these two forms, singular and plural, or one door and two doors, or the ich form I was, and the mia form we were, is maintained. You keep that difference between those two in both varieties. They just do it in a different way. So I'm going to flip topics a little bit. I hope this isn't too abrupt, but I wanted to talk a little bit about my dissertation project, which is about grammatical gender. So in case you don't know what grammatical gender is, it's not necessarily the same as sex or biological gender. Standard German and pretty much, yeah, any other variety of German has three, and that includes Pennsylvania Dutch. So there's masculine, feminine, and neuter. And that can get marked on the definite article, for example, which is the word for the. So you get de Mann, and de is marked for masculine, or de dish. And so as you can see, yeah, man, masculine makes sense. Table doesn't make sense that that's masculine. Who knows why? That's just how it is. And it's the same with all the other groups too. So die Frau, that makes sense. Die Blum, why is that feminine? Nobody knows. It's just how the language works. And then the last one, neuter, two examples are Kind, the child, or Haus, the house. And so one of the things that I noticed when I was learning Standard German, which also has this three-way system, is that it wasn't clear to me why Blum is feminine. And I wondered, because Pennsylvania Dutch is supposed to have this system, why does this not feel more natural to me? So I started to dig into it more. And one of the ways that I've done that is by creating this picture naming task, where I had 8 Pennsylvania Dutch speakers of the Amish of Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, do this task. And I did it to try to get them to say the with different kinds of nouns that I know are different genders, to see how they mark gender on the. And I had 32 nouns, 8 each from masculine, feminine, neuter, and plural. And these are the nouns that you can see here in this table. So they're very common. It's pretty clear what their gender is historically. They're not really debated. And so I had this little conversation for all 32 nouns with the participants. Was siehst du da? What do you see here? Then the participant should say in key und in hand. And then I would say was is circled, and the participant would say the key. And then I can see if they're marking, how they're marking gender on this definite article here, the word for the. And what I found is that there were very few cases of neuter. So in pretty much, well, almost all cases, all but 14.69% of the cases where there was a neuter noun, the participant said duh. And so that's like, okay, well, maybe duh is kind of taking over neuter's space here. So then I also wanted to look at the duh and d, the difference between duh and d. Oops. So I have, before I get into how I did that, I have a recording here that's taken from one of my participants, and it includes nouns from all those categories. So masculine, feminine, neuter, and plural. And what I want you to listen to is that it sounds like she's saying the same thing in all the cases. Duh, 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 duh. That's what I hear. Uh-oh, I have some background noise now. Is that going to disturb the audio?
No, it should be fine.
Okay, so I'm going to play that for you and see if you can hear the how you hear the duh.
Boots and a meisje, de boots. Een hond en een vuus, de hond. Gauw en zeer, de gauw. Boog en een beu, de beu. Medley en een schissel, de medley. Spiegel en een match, de match. Haas en een gobble, de gobble.
Okay, so to me, they all sound the same. Now, there were some cases that were more vague than this. There were some cases that were more like, that was a day. I think day just like is still there to some extent in the language. It's not like it's just completely gone. So I wanted to try to see, without just having to use my own biased judgment, how much de and how much d is there. So one of the, oopsie, I'm playing it again. So one of the ways that I did that was by taking all the definite articles, or the thes from the picture naming task, and I took them out of the recording, which came to 195 in total. And then I had 2 native Pennsylvania Dutch speakers, also from Lancaster, listen to them randomly, and not with the noun. So they just heard like the, whatever. And then they were asked, did you hear a duh or a d? And so that's what we're seeing here in this graph. And so we would expect the for masculine, that's what the M stands for. And we would expect D for feminines and plurals. And we were expecting for neuter. We weren't expecting duh at all, but we did get duh for a lot of neuters as well. So what we're seeing here then on the graph is rater 1 if they heard duh or D, and rater 2 if they heard duh or D for masculine, neuter, feminine, and plural items. But it kind of looks like a mess, right? It doesn't really look like whether it's masculine, neuter, feminine, or plural is predicting if they heard duh or D. And that's pretty much what I concluded based on this. It doesn't really seem like they're hearing a difference. And I didn't really feel like I could hear much of a difference when I was listening to them either. Their mean rate of agreement was 60 or 62%. So the two raters. So yeah, so then to conclude this aside on grammatical gender is clearly changing in Pennsylvania Dutch of the Amish of Lancaster County. I'm not making claims about other communities because, as we've established, there are dialectal differences. They're not all the same. I've listened to some Ohio Amish Pennsylvania Dutch recordings, and they seem to have more of this. They don't seem to have grammatical gender lost to the same extent. They seem to have pretty normal grammatical gender marking. So that leaves me with the question, is grammatical gender changing in other communities too? First of all, to what extent is it still there in Lancaster? And is it changing in other communities as well? So that's something that I hope to address in my dissertation. And then the other point that I want to make is that these changes are probably facilitated by English, which doesn't have grammatical gender. It's just the, it doesn't matter. It's the for everything. But that doesn't mean that English is the only cause. I'm hesitant to say, oh, it's all because of English, any change that we see in a language, because any language that's alive changes. It's very normal. So another potential reason could be that grammatical gender is just complicated and it's really difficult to learn. And originally, it may have had a better reason for existing. It may have actually helped speakers to organize their thoughts and their language better than it does now. It just keeps changing and just keeps getting less and less obvious which noun belongs to which gender and why. That would be one theory at least. And so you could kind of make the argument that maybe grammatical gender is kind of on its way out in all German varieties because it's just not very helpful anymore. That's at least a theory that you could test. And then, but on the flip side, I also want to bring in this point about plurals in Pennsylvania Dutch, which I've also looked at, because this is an example of a complicated system being retained. So in Pennsylvania Dutch, there's 6 different kinds of plural: blom, blomme, hem, hemma, lefli, leflin, hamma, hammas, frein, frein. So there is no plural marking. And then hunt, hent. So this is complicated. This is also hard for people to learn, but it stays. So why do we get a complicated system kind of falling away in one case and then a complicated system being kept in another case? It's a hard question to answer. But what we can say is that English doesn't just cause any complicated system to disappear. This is a language with very, advanced grammar, just like any other language. Okay, so in summary, Pennsylvania Dutch exists as it does only in North, and I also put South there, but really it's a very small minority of them. Only in North America in constant contact with English, which I argue makes it an American phenomenon. It doesn't exist in that form anywhere else in the world. It is spoken by an extraordinarily broad array of religious and regional groups who each use, shape, and identify the language in unique ways. And I never want to make claims about one group, overgeneralize them to every group if that's not appropriate. And also, Pennsylvania Dutch is not frozen in time. Like all living languages, it continues to develop in dynamic and interesting ways. And these developments are sometimes, but not always, in the direction of English. I think that is everything. Dank je zeer voor goed hoortje.